Broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota. My name is Shaun, and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Today, my special guest is Michael Williams, and we're talking about his new book, The Biblical Hebrew Companion for Bible Software Users, and that's published by our friends over at Zondervan Academic. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shaun. It's great to talk with you again.
Well, first off, Michael, let's help the audience to get to know you a bit better. Take a few moments and introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us some of the things you've been up to since we last spoke in early 2014.
Well, I'm Michael Williams, as you've already pointed out, and I'm a professor of Old Testament at Calvin Theological Seminary. And that gives me the opportunity to get involved in all sorts of things, in teaching and writing and preaching the gospel in all sorts of places, and not just churches and academic institutions. One of the things that I've had the opportunity to do recently that I'm really excited about is to get involved with an amazing revival that's going on in Louisiana State Penitentiary, of all places. Inmates with life sentences without parole are finding new life in Jesus Christ. And to see murderers and rapists and armed robbers eating up the Word of God and living for Christ and leading others to do the same is tremendously encouraging for me as I see the power and glory of God so clearly in that dark place where you wouldn't expect it. And things like that have been a great motivation for me as I update my courses and incorporate all the latest tools to make learning and applying the Bible easier and more fruitful for my students, because they'll be taking that powerful Word of God out into the world too. So all sorts of things to keep me busy and to keep me motivated, exciting things going on.
All right, well, thanks for an update on what you've been up to. And as you said, you teach Old Testament at Calvin Theological Seminary. For you, are there any specializations or core classes that you teach there?
Yes, there are. I specialize in the language and culture of ancient Israel and the connections between them and their ancient Near Eastern neighbors. I know it's a mouthful, but one of the first steps toward providing my students some means to access biblical truth more deeply and to make these kinds of connections and get this broader perspective is to teach them the language of the Old Testament. That's one of the core courses I've been doing here at Calvin Seminary in various formats for the last 20 years. And that's really where this book comes out of.
Well, that's a perfect lead into my next question. I always like to get a little bit of perspective of the story behind the book. How did the idea for the Biblical Hebrew Companion for Bible Software Users, how did it get its start, or when were you made aware of this need and it was time to write this book?
Like I said, over 20 years, it's always been a struggle with students because they're investing a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money to take Hebrew, usually over a couple of semesters, and memorizing vocabulary paradigms, and they want to know, and rightly so, that this is all going to pay off in the end. So I try to make their learning of Hebrew as simple and yet as rich as possible for the students. I invest a lot of time and effort in trying to get them to see how what they're doing can enrich their ministry, enrich their own faith as they understand the Bible better. So how do I go about doing this? One of the ways is to show them with each grammar lesson how what they're studying can give them a deeper insight into the text. So I've taken that perspective and included it in the book. But I also want to just make it clear to them it's not something that's at the end of their study that they have to wait for, perhaps after a year before they can benefit from. But they can begin to benefit from these things even during their study. And I want to use the advances in technology as well that have made access to Hebrew so much more possible for so many more people. So combining all of those things that I picked up over a couple of decades of teaching and trying to distill them down into a very usable, accessible, clear, and motivational tool for anyone who wants to benefit from Hebrew.
And that's one of the things I think that's often lost. I mean, I remember in undergrad days learning Greek for the first time, learning Hebrew for the first time, and it seems like you're memorizing a lot, but it was often difficult to take that next step of, oh, this is how it's going to apply to my ministry. This is how it's going to impact my personal study. And so obviously helping students to bridge that gap and make that connection earlier will make that study so much more useful and really meaningful, because in the middle of it all, it's just difficult at times.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. And, good for them for sticking through it. But it would be so much more helpful to them to know that their efforts do have some payoff and to know that so much more immediately.
When you were working on this project, who were the intended or the ideal readers you had in mind? Obviously, college and seminary students are one group of readers that you were thinking about, but moving beyond those readers, what's the range of people that you think are going to benefit from reading this book?
Well, certainly those students, and they're always at the heart of what I'm trying to do, but there are others who can certainly benefit from this, and I had them in mind too when I was writing the book. And one of those groups is pastors and ministry leaders who perhaps have learned Hebrew in the past, but because of the demands of ministry and on their times, the pressure on them, they've forgotten most of what they've learned over the years, and they realized at one time that there was this huge payoff, but they just haven't been able to keep that up. So that extra dimension to their biblical study and what they can deliver to the congregation is missing. So how do they get that back easily without having to sit through another course or read a bulky introductory grammar again and try to wade through all of those details? So this book enables people like that to re-access Hebrew with a minimum of time and effort by the way it's laid out and with the use of technology. And because it's laid out so intuitively and so easy to use, really anyone, whether they've ever studied Hebrew or not, has access to information that the Hebrew can provide by means of their Bible software programs. If they own any kind of Bible software program that has the Hebrew text in it, they, with the use of this book, can benefit from what that software program is telling them. It's not a substitute for learning the language, but it can get them into some of the benefits of the language without having to go through the long process of learning all of the details.
Well, and I think when it comes to Bible software, I know when I was in college, my professors often frowned upon us using software too early. They would say, wait until the third semester of Greek or the third semester of Hebrew before you get something like Accordance or Logos. And these days, you often have, and I'll say kids, because gosh, I'm getting older, I can call them kids, going into college and seminary. A lot of them might get something like Logos or Accordance or BibleWorks that first semester. And so they already have access to those tools. So, the reality is the students have these things already, and how much better is it for them to be learning with these tools rather than relearning how to process several semesters down the road?
Well, right. We can't deny the technological advances that have been made, and we shouldn't deny them either. We should take every advantage of them and list them into the cause of what we're doing here, the cause of Christ, and how we can make this divine revelation better understood for ourselves and to make it better understood for other people. So we don't have to hold these things in tension. It's either learn the old ways with the paradigms and the vocabulary lists and all this, or forget all that and just use the Bible software. Neither one of those is acceptable anymore because we have this technological availability, so why don't we make use of it? But learning that technology all by itself is not the same as learning the language, and a lot of people make that mistake on the other end. There's this huge middle ground where we use the technology but don't confuse it with learning the language that no one is really exploring to see how can we help students appropriate this information more easily using technology and yet not just think that learning a software program is learning the language. And that's what this book is trying to get at, that middle ground there, kind of a compromise position between the two extremes.
Yeah, I think you've really captured the struggle of a lot of language professors, be it at the Bible college level or at the seminary level. There is this weird tension right now where you may have, and we'll just say some of the more tenured professors who want to go old school, as how I would describe it, how I learned some 15, 20 years ago, how you learned, where we just memorized. And then you have all these young punk professors, straight out of grad school with their fancy iPhones and Bible software who are like, well, we want to use all these fancy tools. And so there's this in-between space where there's clearly been a lot of tension But I love how your book is trying to address that need and find that ground in the middle where we can all meet and, bring in the best of both worlds. On the one hand, we do still need to go old school on some things. We do need to learn the paradigms. We do need to learn vocabulary and get functional in the language. But on the other hand, we have some awesome tools that if we combine those two approaches, it can accelerate our learning, accelerate our ability. And I think we'll probably eventually arrive at the same place, but we're going to get there a lot faster.
Well, I've got to start paying you to advertise my book for me, Shaun. That's great. That's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Well, and I'm doing this podcast free of charge. Zondervan just had to send me a book. So, I got my payment. I got the free book, and I always enjoy talking to you. So,
well, thanks,
paid in full.
Okay.
Let's say I'm a student. I'll go back into my student days here, although I have much better technology in front of me than I did back then. But how would I go about putting this book into use? Let's say I'm sitting in the student union, got my MacBook Pro fired up because, well, why wouldn't you want to have a Mac? I always have my
coffee.
Yeah. Always have my coffee nearby because that's just part of who I am. And I'm a bit of a nerd, so I'm going to launch Accordance, BibleWorks, and Logos all at the same time. I've got all three of those on my Mac here now at home, so I could work with any one of those products. But now what? Walk us through, what would it look like for me to be looking at a text in, say, Bible software and applying your book to that study? What does that look like?
Okay, well, yeah, first of all, you don't need all three of those open at the same time. Any Bible software program, any program that has the Hebrew text, my book will help you with. So if you have one of those programs open and you place your cursor over any word in the Hebrew text, any Bible software program will then give you some sort of analytical information about the word that your cursor is over in a window somewhere on the screen. So, for example, placing your cursor over a verb in Hebrew might result in the program informing you that you're looking at an apocryphated hiphil imperfect with a vav conversive. Well, that's just great. And it's helpful if you happen to know what apocryphated means, or hiphil, or imperfect, or vav conversive, what they look like, why you should care. So all you have to do to benefit from that information that's pretty sterile and meaningless otherwise is to look up the words in the Biblical Hebrew Companion to see an explanation of what the word means, what that grammatical form looks like, and how that deepens your understanding of what's going on in the passage. And the grammatical terms the software program is presenting are all arranged alphabetically in the book, so they're easy to find. And the exegetical example for each term will help you see why it is that you should bother knowing this, why you should pay attention to it, and give you a deeper understanding into the biblical text than you could get if you were just reading the English text by itself. So you get motivated, you get informed, all of a sudden you're getting more value added for this software that you have that you've never been able to access before. So it's trying to make the whole experience much more fruitful for you and beneficial as you share what you've discovered with other people.
Well, and I think the layout of the book is one of the things that's really key to how it's going to be useful. And what I really liked is on the left-hand side, you have your definitions and your information about the word that you're looking up. And on the right-hand side, that's where you have the example of the exegetical insight. So you can look something up, but it's not like you have to flip your pages back and forth to what was that definition, what was the example. And we've all dealt with that in other books. But I love that there was some thought put into the layout where you open to that 2-page spread and you have everything you need right in front of you. You don't need to turn the page.
Yeah, and that was really key for me. I insisted with Zondervan that the user be able to see everything they needed to see all at one time. So I envisioned this book sitting beside the computer as people look things up in their Bible software program. And because they only have two hands and they're using those to look up something in their Bible software program, I wanted the book to be able to be open and they could see everything that it had to offer for them at one glance. So they wouldn't have to be flipping pages and trying to figure out what was important and what wasn't important. But everything's clear, condensed, and easy to use.
And at the end of the book, you also include several appendices. Tell us about some of the things you cover there and why it was important to include those in the book.
Yeah, I didn't want this book to be regarded as a Hebrew grammar book. I mean, there's tons of those already out there, and this is not a Hebrew grammar book. But instead, I wanted to provide users with enough information to be able to read and pronounce Hebrew words so that they would have the opportunity to share whatever they discover in using this book with other people. So in the appendices, I provide the basic information they need to do that. So there are appendices that describe, for example, the form and pronunciation of Hebrew consonants and vowels so that you can actually say the words that you're seeing in the Hebrew text, even if you've never learned Hebrew before. Appendices show how accents, syllables, and vowels are all interconnected, and how to read and pronounce Hebrew words. Shows you the pattern that you have to follow. And so even someone who's brand new to the language, and they use this book to see what these words mean and to gain exegetical insights, they can go into the back and say, okay, now how do I pronounce this word so I can talk about this with some other people? Because that's always an important goal of why we do biblical study, at least in my view. And it's not just for our own benefit, but so that we can share this with other people.
Well, and I think one of the things that's key there is it's going to be beneficial to the new student and the student who had Hebrew, say, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. If you want to start getting back into it and you have Bible software, I would suggest even reading through all the appendices is just kind of a refresher to get your mind back on some of the things you learned so long ago.
Right. It'll be very helpful, but it's not necessary, and that's just kind of basic elements of grammar that would help those who want to get a little bit deeper into it, but not necessary to use the main content of the book.
Well, and another feature at the end of the book, you include a scripture index. How are people going to be able to use that?
Well, I wanted this book to provide users with every bit of help that I could squeeze out of it. So when I have all of those exegetical insights for each grammatical term that come from real passages in the Bible, not made-up examples, I list those passages at the end. So if someone is going to be preaching on a text or teaching on a text, or they're studying a text for a Bible study or for small groups, they can go to the back of the book and see if some grammatical issue, some exegetical insight is already provided for them at that passage. And so hopefully that will assist them in their study and in their sharing with other people.
Well, and when it's all said and done, what's your hope? What's your prayer for this book? How would you like to see each reader's language study impacted?
Well, I want everyone, regardless of their level of knowledge of Hebrew, to be able to have at least some access to the deeper level of understanding that knowing Hebrew provides. And knowing Hebrew doesn't give you a different truth than what is available in English, but it does enable a person to gain a deeper understanding of truth than what is available in English. And this book makes that possible for everyone who wants it.
Well, and I'll just say it was a surprise to me when this showed up in the mail last week, and that's just to show people how efficient I am with lining up interviews. But there's been such a need for this sort of a resource, and the conversation around that tension with whether we should go old school or go new school, so to speak, with how we're teaching. That's been a conversation I've been having with people for the last several years. So to see a resource that just hits that sweet spot right in the center, bringing both worlds together, it's just desperately needed. So I was super excited, and I'm excited to see this, one, get used in the classroom, and two, get used by people who are already past their classroom days but still want to get into the language.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. And that's usually the case, isn't it, when there are two opposing sides on an argument? Usually both of them have a piece of the truth. It is true that we need to understand something of Hebrew in order to benefit from the deeper insights into the text. And it is true that we have these technological resources available. So let's combine those two pieces of the truth to something that benefits from both of them instead of setting them against each other.
And we were talking a bit before we got the interview started. I know some of my listeners are automatically thinking, well, is there going to be a Greek version of this companion? And it sounds like there is a Greek edition in the works as well.
There is, and it should be out a little bit later, probably next year. Mark Strauss from Bethel Seminary is working on that, and it'll be the same sort of information and the same sort of format.
My hat's off to Zondervan Academic. I have just been thoroughly impressed with all of the quality language resources they've been producing, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. They have just made some amazing leaps and bounds, and there aren't a lot of publishers willing to continue publishing in this space because academic isn't always the place to make a ton of money, but Zondervan Academic has had a real passion, and wow, they just keep bringing us great resources to keep us in the languages, so I hope they keep them coming.
Yeah, I hear you. I can second your appreciation for them. They've been very encouraging in this regard.
Well, Michael, if the listeners are interested in learning more about you, learning more about your books, where are some of the places they can find you on the web?
Well, there are a couple of YouTube videos, very short ones, where I describe the book and its benefits. So just search under the name of the book in YouTube, and you can easily access those. or you can drop me a line at my email address that you can find on Calvin Seminary's webpage, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
All right. Well, and I'll be sure to include those videos. I'll have links in the show notes for Michael's Amazon author page and his faculty bio on the seminary website, and you'll be able to find those show notes over at shauntabatt.com. And it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation today with Michael Williams, talking about his new book, The Biblical Hebrew Companion for Bible Software Users. For more on Michael and his books, be sure to check out his Amazon author page and his faculty bio page on the Calvin Theological Seminary website. And you can also find out more about his great books at his publisher's website, and you'll be able to find that at Zondervan.com. Michael, just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you too, Shaun, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book and for the good work you do through your show.
And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@shauntabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @stabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.